why don't we begin? I want to welcome everybody to the spring 2021 workshop midterm briefings for the MPA in Environmental Science Policy. It's hard to believe, but we're a week away from what they're calling spring break this semester. That's because we've started so early. And today we're going to hear progress reports from our 5 groups that are working very hard for clients to provide this public service that the program has been providing since we began in 2002. So part of what we're doing at this point is hearing methodologies. How are these studies being conducted? What are the topics? What are our clients asking for? And where do we think we're going to end up when we do our final briefings? So the first briefing we presented by Carson Ross, that's on climate change resilience through agricultural water reuse for food and wine production in the Hudson River Valley, New York. Say that 3 times fast. So Carson, if you're ready, why don't you put up your PowerPoint and begin your briefing?
Sure. Okay, everyone can hear me okay?
Very good.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Carson, and I'll be presenting on water reuse in the Hudson Valley. So today I'll introduce you to our client and project, and then walk you through our research approach, preliminary findings, and some of our next steps. Our team is exploring climate change resilience through water reuse in food and wine production in the Hudson Valley. Water reuse or water recycling are terms I'll be using interchangeably, and this refers to capturing water before it enters waste streams or waterways to put to various uses. Most water recycling takes place in arid regions, but sustainable water management practices are important even in water abundant areas like New York. This is especially true with respect to climate change resiliency and in the face of increasing regional climate variability. Our client is Carrie Capuzzo, the Director of Strategic Initiatives of the Water Reuse Association. The Water Reuse Association is the only trade association that focuses solely on advancing laws, policy, and funding to increase water use. Its members include water utilities, businesses, government agencies, and nonprofits, and they're currently in 38 states and 11 countries. In the US, water use has projects to increase resiliency in water-stressed areas like California, Arizona, and Florida, where declining freshwater resources threaten food production, community drinking water, industrial processes, and pretty much every aspect of life. Now the association has asked us to work with them, spearheading novel research into the current and future potential for water recycling in water-rich areas, where water isn't looked at as a disappearing resource right now, but it may become less dependable in a future and more variable climate. Our team will be producing a report and recommendations on the state of water reuse in food and wine production in the Hudson Valley to be used in the Water Reuse Association's efforts to advance national legislation around water reuse in water-rich agricultural areas throughout the country. The Hudson Valley includes several counties north of New York City, and for our research purposes, we're focusing on the 10 counties included in this map. But interestingly, the boundaries of the region actually vary depending on different agencies and stakeholders. And so the scope of our research occasionally takes us outside of this area. The Hudson Valley is a rich agricultural region with nearly 3,500 individual farms covering over 500,000 acres of farmland, which includes dairy farms, fruit orchards, vegetable farms, cereal growers, and it's a large wine producing region with around 35 wineries. Although it is a water abundant region, the Hudson Valley is expected to face increasing climate variability, including in precipitation patterns, which will lead to heavy rainfall events intermixed with drier periods and could lead to short-term droughts in the summer growing season. Additionally, the Hudson Valley is experiencing temperature increases and sea level rise at a faster rate than the global and national averages, which could lead to tidal flooding in the lower Hudson River. So we're asking a number of questions to inform our report, including what is the policy landscape around water reuse in New York? What kind of interests, incentives, or barriers are there to adopt water reuse technologies? Is recycled water currently used in food and wine production in the Hudson Valley? What kind of water reuse technology is available or might be locally appropriate to the Hudson Valley context? And finally, what institutions, agencies, cooperatives, or funders exist who may be interested in partnering with water reuse in introducing water reuse into their own practices? And based on those questions, we've organized our research around 4 guiding pillars. These are policy, food and wine production, technology, and key actors. And these will inform an analytic strategy. So to start with policy, we found there are no formal water reuse guidelines or regulations for New York State, which includes no statewide water quality or treatment standards for reuse. However, New York does have regulations around stormwater discharge and requires companies or industries that are building impermeable surfaces to purchase what can be very expensive permits. And so this isn't explicitly related to reuse, but we do see it as a possible indicator that there could be interest or even a financial incentive to capture and recycle stormwater in order to avoid buying those costly permits. Another interesting finding is a new resolution in California, which is requiring wineries there to pre-treat their wastewater before allowing it to enter municipal streams. Because the water used in the wine production process is high in concentrated organic compounds, it can strain municipal wastewater treatment facilities. And so again, this is something to keep an eye on for New York State wine production as well. Then exploring agricultural practices in the Hudson Valley, we found only about 2.2% of farmland in the Hudson Valley currently has irrigation infrastructure. So we suspect that this is primarily vineyards and orchards, but we're hoping to find specific data on where that infrastructure exists through conversations with farmers. We also found that because water is relatively cheap and readily available in the Hudson Valley, there isn't evidence that farmers there are using recycled water for irrigation. But again, this is something we're going to ask about directly when we start speaking to local growers. Also, in response to the California resolution I just mentioned, we're also encouraged by a study from California that finds winery wastewater to be a viable possibility for irrigation. But the study does note that the salinity of the wine wastewater must be carefully monitored, and specific soil mineralogy will also determine how appropriate this technology is on a case-by-case basis. And so further research will be needed to assess the potential for wine wastewater on Hudson Valley vineyards for irrigation. Our research has indicated that there are many ways to capture and treat water for reuse, which vary by source and by end use. So far, we think that the technology we'll be most concerned with is stormwater capture and wine wastewater reuse for irrigation. We also may look further into tailwater, which is irrigation or rainfall runoff from fields. And this will be based on our conversations with farmers about what kind of irrigation or drainage infrastructure is commonly used in the Hudson Valley. And so far, it does look like there are a number of private companies developing specific technologies for each of these uses. And so we'll be looking more into what kind of technology could be tailored to the different needs and also the different budgets of Hudson Valley producers. So far, our team has identified more than 40 regional stakeholders, a few of which are shown on the slide, and they include state agencies, local nonprofits, research centers, farming cooperatives, and tech companies. We've been in touch with several already, and our goal is to reach out to as many as possible for interviews, and we're also hoping to conduct a survey to gather data directly from growers and producers. And we believe that this firsthand information will fill in gaps in our research to better understand the general perspectives and knowledge of water reuse locally, potential incentives or obstacles, including the costs of technology, and any other useful data or information that comes up in those conversations. Our analytic approach includes tools for both quantitative and qualitative data analysis, which will be specifically informed by our 4 research pillars. We'll first be conducting a stakeholder analysis where we'll rank primary and secondary stakeholders by how influential they are in the region or how connected they are to the issue, which we'll use to create a matrix to visualize that ranking. And the goal of this tool is to identify high-ranking stakeholders who may serve as a champion for water reuse practices or legislation in the region. Then we'll also be conducting a cost benefit to determine the extent to which cost is a barrier to implementing water reuse technology, and an ecological analysis to evaluate potential effects of a proposed water reuse strategy on the region in respect to regional ecology. And finally, using that secondary research, the data collected from interviews and surveys, and the previously mentioned analytic tools, we'll put together a SWOT in which we'll identify the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats associated with each of our 4 research pillars, which again are policy, food and wine, technology, and key actors or stakeholders. And ultimately, this SWOT will inform our recommendations to the client. So our next steps include interviewing stakeholders, surveying food and wine producers, and then using the information we gather to conduct our data analyses. And finally, we'll be creating a report, and the client aims for this project to serve as a model for water reuse strategies in other water-rich areas throughout the country. Thank you, and I'll now take any questions.
Thank you. Very nice person. Stephanie will recognize some questioners if we have any.
Yes, you guys can raise your digital Zoom hand or type it in the chat. So it looks like Colleen has one. Colleen, you can go first. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes. Good morning. Thank you, Carson. Colleen here. Just a clarifying question that I thought was really interesting if I understood you correctly. So I know you said there's New York City, I believe it was city regulations on wastewater discharge, but I believe you said there's no regulations on the reuse. So is that correct, that there's no regulations on the reuse? And if that is, then what, I'm sure there is, but maybe there's not, what regulates using this recycled water as a new input for agriculture? I'm primarily thinking in terms of like water quality, or is there no regulations there? Maybe I just misunderstood.
Yeah, that's okay. So we weren't looking at New York City, we're looking at New York State. And so what we found so far is that there's no statewide regulations on water quality for reuse, and there's more, which does exist in some other states, particularly like California and Arizona have more experience with water reuse and more like statewide legislation. I think that there are regulations in New York City, although that wasn't really the focus of our research. So yeah, what we're more finding is there are definitely regulations around discharge into water bodies, but nothing specifically for reuse in agriculture that we've come across so far.
Oh, super interesting. Thank you, Carson.
Yeah.
All right, Jenny, you're up next.
Great job. Very interesting topic. I wanted to ask, are you only looking at reusing water for agricultural irrigation, or are you looking at other ways to reuse?
Good question. So I think the client was originally interested in the Hudson Valley because it's such a big food and wine producing region. And so I think irrigation was sort of the jumping off point. But as we've been doing the research, we've come across some other interesting uses. Like I mentioned the wine wastewater. There's actually a lot of different points in the wine production process where water is used. We also have come across examples in other water-rich areas that use wastewater for golf course irrigation and other like recreational uses. So we're expanding our research a little bit into sort of recreational use and commercial use, but I think irrigation for food and wine production is still the focus.
All right, Maya, you're up next. This will be our last question.
Carson, good job. So I was wondering, since the Hudson Valley is unlike some other places with water recycling, like Arizona, where else might this work be applicable?
Good question. So I think the thing that makes this research really interesting and novel is that we are looking at a water-rich area, whereas most water reuse focuses on places like Arizona or California. But this could definitely be applicable for other water abundant region. So I think like the Northeast in general, but also we found some case studies from like the Traverse City area in Michigan. There's an interesting winery there that uses wastewater in their wine production process. So I think, yeah, like the Northeast kind of Great Lakes area, Michigan, all of that, it could be applicable.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent job, group. Rather than take a break, let's move into our second briefing, which is by the group, advised by Professor Hill, a federal policy to manage refrigerant banks. And the presenter is Allison Day. So Allison, if you're ready, perhaps we could see your screen and you could begin.
Allison, let me unmute you here. There you go. I think you should be good.
Thank you. All right. All right. Let me see. Is this working?
There you go.
There we go. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Day, and I'm here to present our midterm briefing on behalf of my team on the work we've been doing with the management of refrigerant banks. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about our client and what we've been asked to do, and then go over what HFCs are and why they're so important. And then I will end with our research so far. So our client is the Natural Resources Defense Council, and of course you all know them as one of the premier environmental nonprofits in the US. They are leaders in lots of environmental issues, including air quality and climate, but they deal with the full spectrum of environmental issues. Since the 1970s, they've been working on refrigerant management, which is timely because some new legislation at the end of 2020 was just passed that will help them advance those advocacy efforts that they've been working on for decades. This new legislation is called the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, or the AIM Act. And the goal of that is to reduce the use of HFC refrigerants by 85% in the next 15 years. And I'll go into detail about what that means later. This bill passed with bipartisan support in Congress and has also received support from the HFC industry. So this presents a great opportunity for managing HFC refrigerants. So where my team comes in is we are doing research to determine best practices for HFC management. And we're going to make recommendations to the NRDC as they inform their own recommendations to give to the US Environmental Protection Agency as they implement this new legislation. So before I go into the other details, I want to take a second to go over some terminology. So HFCs stands for hydrofluorocarbons, and they are a powerful greenhouse gas that's also used as a refrigerant. They are non-ozone depleting substances, which is important to note because HFCs were brought in as refrigerants as the successors to the infamous chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which were ozone depleting substances. So after the Montreal Protocol, CFCs were phased out and HFCs were brought in to replace refrigerants. But then we soon realized that HFCs were contributing to climate change. So now the move is to go away from HFCs and replace them with some climate-friendly alternative refrigerants. When I talk about the refrigerant bank, what I mean is all the installed HFC refrigerants in the US that we're managing here. HFCs are found in lots of products, but a big part of our scope is concerned with commercial applications of them, so like big commercial cooling systems. And then, so with mitigation approaches, there are two main ones. The first is the bank management, so managing the refrigerant banks. And the second is the phase down. So in our scope, we're mostly concerned with bank management. And that actually complements the phase down that's already going to be happening because of the new legislation. And to highlight the difference a little bit more, phase down has to do with reducing the production and consumption of HFCs, and bank management has to do more with the HFC life cycle and preventing leakages throughout the HFC's life cycle in appliances. So take 1 second more to emphasize how big of a problem HFCs are. Greenhouse gases have a global warming potential, which describes their heat trapping capacity when they're in the atmosphere. So for reference, carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1. And HFCs, on the other hand, have a global warming potential in the range of hundreds or thousands. So one HFC molecule can have thousands of times more impact than a molecule of carbon dioxide. To illustrate this a little bit more, a single supermarket can leak 25% of its HFC refrigerants each year. And that leakage has the same impact on our climate as the annual emissions from 400 fossil fuel powered vehicles. So as you can see here, HFCs have an extremely potent greenhouse effect, and their phase out and management of these emissions is essential, especially now. Without proper management, it's predicted that HFC emissions will add an additional 0.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. And that's especially scary considering that the goal of the Paris Agreement is to have no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. So if we can manage these cooling systems correctly, we can avoid this massive contribution to climate change. In our research, we wanted to understand the HFC ecosystem a little bit more. Because we don't think about HFCs generally in refrigeration a lot in our lives, but we're thinking about it a little bit more now because of the logistical issues that we've seen getting super freezers to keep the COVID-19 vaccines cold. So as that illustrates that our society is so reliant on HFCs, and they're really critical to so many things that we just take for granted. So we started by looking at the producers. The biggest producers of HFC are the US and China. And several US-based producers of HFCs are also producing the HFC alternatives, the more climate-friendly alternatives. So they're actually ready for this transition away from HFCs. It just hasn't happened yet because it's such a massive undertaking for the country. As for users, HFCs are used in a lot of different appliances, but 90% of them are used for refrigeration and cooling purposes. And that's mostly for buildings and for vehicles. And there's also some less extensively used applications like for fire suppressants and inhalers. And then for end users, that's everyday people. We mostly come into contact with HFCs in our home air conditioning and the refrigerator in your kitchen. But for our scope, like I said, we're more focused on the commercial uses like supermarket refrigeration. In our research, we were also looking at what other countries are doing to phase down and manage their own HFC banks. So we looked specifically at certain areas in the US. We looked at the European Union and Japan and Australia. We've been doing kind of case studies with them and looking at data and HFC trends from those areas to see the effect of the legislation they've already passed. We've also been talking to experts in the HFC policy field and experts in industry to get that insider perspective. So far, the big takeaways are that refrigerant bank management is a really complex issue, but it is essential. So for example, we found that Australia passed legislation to reduce the imports of HFCs because Australia doesn't actually produce any HFCs of its own. But this legislation didn't address the end of life processes for HFCs. So that's like recycling and reclamation. And as a result, the reclamation rate of HFCs is just a fraction of a percent. So from that, we can see it's clear that if we want good bank management, we need to consider all of the steps in the HFC life cycle. So we've done a lot of research so far, but of course there is more to do. We are interested in looking at what percent of HFCs can be reclaimed instead of using new HFCs. And we also need to interview some more experts to fill in some gaps in the data that we've come across in our research into Japan and the EU. And we also are interested in determining whether or not the US has the physical infrastructure that it needs to be able to handle the phase down of HFCs across the country. For phase 2 of our research, we're asking the question, what can be done about the existing bank in the US, and where specifically can we target interventions in the HFC life cycle? We're going to give our recommendations for these different tasks to the NRDC, and hopefully that will inform what they recommend to the EPA, and all of that will go into helping with this goal of the 85% phase down of HFCs in the next 15 years, and also reduce the HFC contribution to climate change. So HFCs are not usually the first thing that people think about when they think of greenhouse gases, but we've shown here that they are a huge threat to the stability of the climate because of their high global warming potential. But it is great news that this new legislation has been passed, and our work with the NRDC to recommend refrigerant bank management strategies to EPA will hopefully make a big difference in terms of reducing these dangerous emissions and will help make the transition to climate-friendly alternatives easier. So with that, we are looking forward to sharing our findings with you during the final briefing in April. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you. Nice job, Allison. Stephanie will again recognize questioners.
Sure. All right, Sophie, you're up.
Hi, Allison. That was a great presentation. I have a quick question for you. This might just be my lack of knowledge. You mentioned environmentally friendly like alternatives to the refrigerant. I was just curious if you could provide any examples of what that would be.
Yeah, so HFCs, we said that they have a range, their global warming potential range can be hundreds or 1,000 times more than carbon dioxide. So these alternatives, they still have a higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide, but it's a lot less than what we are currently using now. So I think the cutoff for a low global warming potential alternative is 150. I might be wrong. So if somebody in my group wants to correct me in the chat, that'd be great. But yeah, the goal is to just get it, I think, into triple digits or double digits for the global warming potential.
All right, Tunde, you're up.
Hi, Allison. That was great. I had a quick question about the case studies, the countries that you guys chose to look at, and I was wondering how you guys selected those. Just based, I was just thinking more. This is based on my probably uninformed understanding of the issue, but I would think that the biggest potential for growth in indoor air conditioning is probably in the developing world, just considering how many people are, how incomes and livelihoods are growing in that part of the world. And I would think that maybe that might be a good place to look in terms of if not what they're doing right, but I guess yeah, maybe even what they're doing right there. That seems like a place where there might be an opportunity to learn. I was wondering how you guys picked your case studies.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about the increase in air conditioning in developing countries, but I think our target areas came from our client, because our client was more concerned about the commercial application, so not the home air conditioning, more like grocery store refrigeration aisles. So we were targeting those countries that are really that's where the commercial stuff is happening. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely, yes, thanks.
All right, Colleen, you can ask a question.
And really interesting presentation. Thank you. So I believe, or you may have touched on this, so it's either a clarifying question or just a question based off what you presented. So it's about barriers to transitioning to the let's say, quote unquote, climate friendly refrigerants. Like, what are the barriers? Is it the technology changes to use the new types of refrigerants? Are the cooling properties different? Are there chemical lobbyists involved that if there's something there for the refrigerant manufacturers to lose, should they ramp up production of the quote unquote climate friendly types? So could you elaborate on if it's one of those, which is the biggest barrier, or if it's something I'm not thinking about? If you could elaborate on it, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple barriers. One of them is that not all appliances can use the HFC alternative. So there has to be a little bit of that technical transition there. But in terms of developing the actual alternatives, we have a lot of those already, and a lot of HFC producers already have those alternatives ready to go. So that's why industry has been in support of this transition for a while, actually. I think there was a third part of your question.
I
there?
think you've
Is that
answered
good?
it. It was just,
Okay.
yeah, if there's something that the manufacturer stand to lose, but I think you answered it sufficiently.
Yeah. Oh, one more thing is that not all HFC manufacturers, that's what I was going to say. Not all HFC manufacturers are manufacturing alternatives. So those smaller companies that are manufacturing HFCs for the more specific applications, they're not such a fan of this new requirement to transition. So that's another thing to consider as we make this transition.
Thank you.
All right, that was our last question.
Okay, thank you. Excellent work. Why don't we take like a 3-minute break before our next briefing, give people an opportunity to stretch their legs, and then we will resume. Okay, so it's now 9:31. We'll start up at 9:34.
Anna, do you want to see if you have control of my screen? Perfect. Let's see where you are.
Are you able to hear me, Stephanie?
Yeah,
Great.
thanks.
Okay, let's resume. Our next briefing is from the group advised by Professor McGinnis, and it's called Building Equity, Advancing Racial Justice in Federal Flood Infrastructure Projects. And if you're ready to begin, Anna, take it away.
Great, thanks, Dr. Cohen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Beeman, and today I will be giving a briefing on our team's progress on our project for the NAACP on advancing racial justice and federal flood infrastructure projects. I'd first like to thank my entire team for their hard work on this, as well as thank our faculty advisor, Eileen McGinnis, for her guidance and support. I'll begin today with a description of our client. Second, I'll discuss what problem we are trying to solve. Third, I will detail our research process and methodology, then identify some challenges and opportunities we have come across so far, highlight our progress to date, and finally describe next steps for our project. We're extremely honored to introduce our capstone client and partner, the NAACP. Most of us have heard of the NAACP. They are the oldest and largest civil rights organization in the country, with over 2,000 local chapters, now called units, and over 2 million member activists fighting to eliminate race-based discrimination and ensure health and well-being of all persons. For this capstone, we are excited to work alongside the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice team, led by Jackie Patterson and Mandy Lee, as well as with the support of local units in Louisiana, Texas, and Oregon, to advance equity and racial justice in federal flood infrastructure projects, specifically programs administered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So what problem are we trying to solve? When communities experience natural disasters, a recent 2018 study determined that on average, white individuals accumulate $75,000 in wealth, whereas Black individuals lose $50,000 in wealth. But how does that happen? This stark contrast is the result of an equitable and unjust allocation of federal resources after a natural disaster. The studies are part of a growing body of literature that are illuminating the injustices in how aid is distributed to low-wealth communities of color after disasters such as major flooding. For our project with NAACP, we were actually focused on the precursor to this, specifically examining the structural inequities and injustices that exist before natural disasters hit. There is a need to identify opportunities and barriers that exist for frontline low-wealth communities of color to receive federal flood infrastructure that would help close this wealth gap and ensure that they are protected from flooding disasters. The NAACP has requested that we focus on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the cost-benefit analysis they use to prioritize flood infrastructure projects, which predominantly includes levees and dams, as well as more recent nature-based infrastructure such as wetlands. Their cost-benefit analysis has historically prioritized metrics like property value and economic development, thus raises many concerns about equity and justice in flood infrastructure planning. We are learning that decisions about who and what gets prioritized for federal flood protection projects is quite complicated due to the bureaucracies and processes in place. This can make it very difficult for communities to advocate for themselves and the flood protection they need. This is even more difficult and complicated if you're underrepresented in the political process. So our two main project goals is to first decipher how are these decisions made and how these decisions further entrench racial and socioeconomic inequities, particularly in Black communities. Second, how can communities use this knowledge to successfully advocate for themselves to be prioritized for Army Corps federal flood protection projects? In terms of our research process, our first task was to refine our research questions and scope of the project in collaboration with our engaged partners at NAACP to help meet their needs. From there, in order to tackle this multifaceted problem and to generate comprehensive research and analysis for our clients, our team needed to divide into 4 main focus areas: federal policy, local policy and case studies, nature-based solutions, and data analysis and visualization. The federal policy team has done a thorough literature review of the federal policies and associated decision-making processes. And our local policy team has been thinking about the local application of these processes in St. Louis, New Orleans, and Indianapolis. The nature-based solutions team is investigating nature-based infrastructure and identifying how communities can advocate for this infrastructure over traditional systems such as levees and dams. Finally, our data team is using GIS analysis to understand the trends in the relationships among race, socioeconomic status, levee protected areas, and flood exposure. So to help fill in gaps and ensure that we are getting a variety of insights for our research and policy recommendations, we will also be using expert interviews from a range of perspectives, from the Army Corps, as well as from community advocacy and environmental justice groups, local governments, data analysis experts, and nonprofits. So one of the largest challenges we faced as a group is aligning client needs with team capabilities, especially balancing the expectations and goals from the national office and the local units. In order to support our recommendations, we also face the challenge of finding illustrative and compelling case studies to help inform NAACP's advocacy and raise awareness. The data component of our project has also been challenging due to data limitations and availability. Our data team met with NAACP last week on determining what kind of analysis is most useful for them: a forward-looking analysis to see how current levee locations will generate inequities, or a historical analysis about levee location and how communities have been impacted in the past. We are leaning towards a forward-looking analysis based on client feedback so far. We have come across many opportunities in our research. In one of our early interviews with a representative from Army Corps, we learned that there are new policy directives within the Army Corps for potentially improved criteria that address race, socioeconomic status, and human health within the Army Corps' preliminary analysis of a flood project. As one Army Corps representative put it, the Army Corps is like an aircraft carrier. When it's moving on the ground, it takes a lot of effort to turn, but when it does turn, large-scale changes can happen. We see this as an opportunity for NAACP and an opening for more effective advocacy, which will give value to our analysis when we advise our client on what gaps to address within the Army Corps' decision-making process. So far, we have done a deep dive into literature and analyzed major studies and government reports on the U.S. Army Corps cost-benefit analysis and project selection criteria, as well as on our local case studies. We are learning that there are some gaps in the literature, such as there's only a handful of research done specifically on equity outcomes of U.S. Army Corps cost-benefit analysis, as well as not much publicly accessible data on this. We've also had 2 client meetings so far, which has helped refine the scope of the project to better support the local NAACP units working towards equitable flood infrastructure planning. Finally, we have met with several expert stakeholders on the topic to gain different perspectives, as well as heard from New Orleans activists on their lived experiences with flood injustices. Last week, we attended a movie screening and discussion featuring New Orleans Lower Ninth Ward resident and filmmaker Kimberly Rivers Roberts, who had filmed her experiences through Hurricane Katrina. Our team valued hearing from her directly about her experiences and activism on flood issues. Our next step to develop a useful report and guide for our client to use in national and local advocacy efforts is as follows. We will need to clearly explain and visualize the Army Corps flood infrastructure project decision-making process, as well as identify the key stakeholders in this process. Within this analysis, we plan on identifying where equity considerations may fall short and where national and local units of NAACP can influence the process. Second, we will provide NAACP with maps that identify some case studies and provide data on which communities are prioritized as a result of the benefit cost analysis and project selection. In addition to the data portion of the case studies, we will also provide policy analysis and research to illustrate successes and challenges in developing more equitable local flood mitigation projects for use by the local units. Finally, we will provide information and help raise awareness on nature-based solutions and alternatives for flood mitigation projects. And we will be delivering all this information in the form of a final report and briefing to the NAACP. So we're really excited to continue this work over the rest of the semester and are looking forward to sharing our findings in April. I'd be happy to take any questions, and thank you for listening.
Excellent work. Great job, Anna. Great job, team. Okay, Stephanie will again recognize questioners.
Yes. All right, Leanne, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, kind of going off Tunde's question earlier, on the last presentation, obviously, like with Katrina, New Orleans makes sense as a case study. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on the other cities that you chose and why, or even speak a little more to New Orleans as well.
Sure. Yeah, so the client specifically wanted us to focus on the Gulf Coast and Midwest regions, but we specifically picked these cities because they were among the cities with the most sort of complete data for the metrics that we were examining, but also say that these 3 cities also have predominantly Black communities. They all have levees, but kind of range in terms of which communities the levees protect and which communities are flood exposed. So that is interesting for analysis and we think would be useful for NAACP.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Louisa, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Great job. I just wanted to ask a quick question. I know in the beginning, I thought you were kind of also looking at other flood infrastructure projects, but then your strategy kind of looks as if you're only looking at levees. So are you just looking at levees or are there other flood infrastructure projects that you're focusing on?
Yeah, so this is something we had to sort of navigate as a team as well. So I would say most of the data that's available is on levees, which is a data limitation, but definitely still yields important information about inequities. But also say that we're also looking at nature-based infrastructure, and we've heard from the Army Corps that they're interested in these types of solutions and are trying to move towards that direction. So we thought that that would also be a useful part of our analysis to NAACP.
All right, our last question's from Griffin.
Hi, Anna. Great presentation. I'm curious about one of the slides that you had in the presentation that showed that after a disaster, white residents there's a positive gain in wealth, whereas Black residents have a negative a loss of wealth. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that. I spent some time thinking about it after it was a very compelling figure.
Yeah, sure. So this study actually came from a study in 2018. This was a study that focused on the FEMA benefit cost analysis. But there has been also studies, on US Army Corps benefit cost analysis. And I think, as I mentioned, that benefit cost analysis prioritizes property value pretty strongly historically, as well as economic development, not even just for the local area, but for the country as a whole. So there is a recognition sort of like within Army Corps, we're seeing that there needs to be change, and they're trying to figure out sort of right now how to do that change. So yeah, I can definitely send you the study if you're interested to read it more, but that one I would say was more of a FEMA related cost benefit analysis.
All right, that was our last question.
Okay, thank you. Excellent job, group. Looking forward to the final briefing. So we'll turn now to our next project, which is the one advised by Professor Rosen, and it's entitled "What Financial and Economic Incentives Exist for Restoration in the United States?" And Rishika Chowdhury is our briefer, so if we could begin, let's start.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Rishika Chowdhury, and I'll be presenting on financial incentives for land restoration in the United States.
Rishika, let me try something really quick.
Okay, thank you. Can you just go back one slide?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So as for our agenda, first we're going to be looking at the problem and what land degradation is and what exactly land restoration means. Then I'm going to introduce our client, the World Resources Institute, and how our research fits into their work. Then I'll talk more specifically about our project and the scope of it. And lastly, I'll conclude with some of the challenges we've experienced, as well as our next steps. So the problem in this case is land degradation, which is an enormous issue caused by deforestation, unsustainable agriculture, and climate change. And consequences of degraded landscapes include the loss of critical habitats, decreased agricultural productivity, and the reduced capacity for capturing and storing carbon. Globally, 3 billion people face the consequences of land degradation, and in the US, the annual cost of erosion from agriculture alone is over $44 billion, which means that we need sustainable solutions. One of these solutions is land restoration, which has a broad definition, but generally seeks to make degraded ecosystems healthier by increasing ecological productivity. And specifically for our project, we are examining this through the lens of nature-based solutions, which includes actions such as protecting, managing, and restoring forests, adopting regenerative agriculture practices, and more generally restoring the natural balance of various ecosystems in a way that benefits people and the environment. So our client is the World Resources Institute, which is a global think tank and research organization that does work in 60 countries as of now. Their mission is to move human society to live in ways that protect Earth's environment and its capacity to provide for the needs of current and future generations. We are specifically working with WRI's Global Restoration Initiative, and in prior years, capstone project teams have worked with this initiative as well to research restoration policies in developing countries such as Brazil, Mexico, and India. And now our team is focusing in on the United States. So for our project, the purpose is to identify scalable land restoration policies with financial incentive mechanisms that can be replicated more broadly across the United States of America. And the goal for our database is to build upon past frameworks and adapt it for the United States, such that it's useful in WRI algorithms. Our project is also meant to work in tandem with WRI's Policy Accelerator, which will analyze websites using an algorithm in order to find policies that, in order to find relevant policies. Our analysis will also provide context for the restoration policies that it discovers. Also, our final deliverable includes a report that highlights our findings at the state and federal level. So as for methodology, in order to conduct our research, we began by identifying federal and state level policies and programs by using various government websites. We then split into 3 teams to research policies in depth and enter them into a preliminary policy database. Now, we also conducted interviews with policy experts from government agencies and research organizations. Now we are collaborating and consulting with WRI's data team and policy consultants in order to build our final policy database to be incorporated into WRI's Policy Accelerator. The final database will include the policy as well as analysis, a primary incentive, the land use type, the type of degradation it is aiming to restore, as well as the nature-based solution and restoration mechanism. So our initial approach was to broadly understand the scope of restoration work in the US by researching state and federal level policies, as well as the actors involved. Through our initial research and discussions with our client and experts in the field, we did end up narrowing down the scope of our project to focus on incentives for privately owned land restoration. This is because economic and financial incentives such as tax credits or land easements are just easier to trace when it's geared towards private landowners. Also, as you can see in the map, 61% of all land in the United States is privately owned. So just looking at private lands gives us a larger scope. That said, we specifically chose to do thorough research in California, Colorado, and Maryland because of their progressive policies, varied ecosystems, and representation of 3 different US regions. So first in California, we chose it because it is representative of the Western United States with various ecosystems and landscapes ranging from coastal lands, deserts, mountains, forests, and more. California does face many threats because of this that degrade the landscape, including wildfires, flooding, coastal degradation, soil depletion, and drought, and deforestation. However, California also has many progressive restoration policies that help combat these issues. One example of this is California's Forest Legacy Program, which is managed by the United States Forest Service in partnership and implemented under the state agencies to encourage the protection of privately owned forest lands through easements or land purchases. Protection of private forests through this program maintains a multitude of public benefits, including preventing wildfires. So next with Colorado, it's unique because it has over 60 ecological systems due to its unique geography, as well as elevational grading across the state, which allows for prairie fields to mountain forests to woodlands, canyons, and more. Some of the environmental threats, though, include water shortages, wildfires, land erosion, soil depletion, and deforestation. One way that Colorado does address these problems is through the Great Outdoors Colorado program, which aims to boost local economies through tourism and protect local communities through things like wildfire management. This program has committed over $1.3 billion in order to provide various financial incentives such as grants, easements, and land purchases in order to fund preservation and restoration projects for parks, wildlife, and nature, as well as private lands. And to date, over 5,000 restoration projects have been launched under this program. And the last state we looked at is Maryland, which ranges from mountains, forests, wetlands, as well as estuaries. And some of the environmental threats as a result include flooding, deforestation, soil degradation, urban sprawl, as well as chemical contamination. One example, though, of a successful restoration initiative has been the Maryland Nutrient Trading Program, which allows businesses and farmers to generate credits by improving water quality. They can then sell these credits through state marketplace to businesses that have a negative impact on water quality, which in turn raises the price of pollution. In the end, by placing a price on pollution, the water quality in the Chesapeake Bay is improved. And in this state that depends on fishing industry, preserving the quality of the bay is really a key economic development initiative. And at the same time, it does reward farmers for pesticide-free agricultural practices, which in turn also improves the soil quality. I just also like to note here that although we aren't explicitly focused on water restoration, this was particularly an example due to its direct impacts on agriculture. So some of our biggest challenges so far in this project has been defining the problem as well as project terminology, as well as just refining the scope of the project alongside the World Resources Institute to be something useful for them and their algorithms, as well as accomplishable within our time frame. Concepts including restoration, nature-based solutions, and incentives can be quite broad, so it was difficult to define them within the context of our project initially. And because the Global Restoration Initiative has also yet to examine the United States, and because restoration is such a broad topic, we have to quickly get a handle on the status of restoration work across this country before actually narrowing down our focus. This is partly because that restoration work in the US is done by multiple government agencies, which is quite different than other countries that WRI has looked at. Consequently, a third challenge we faced was navigating the many different state and federal level agencies to identify and understand the restoration policies, especially because of many of these policies are actually implemented as various programs at a state level as well. So now that we've been able to address and look at some of these challenges, some of the next steps for our team include working with WRI's data team to continue our research in our selected states much more in depth. Then we will continue to create a policy database. And finally, we will conduct a cross-state analysis and comparison in order to examine the similarities and differences in restoration policies so we can identify scalable successes. Thank you for listening, and I'll now take any questions you may have.
Again, very good job. Good job, team. Good job, Shika. If we have some questions, Stephanie will recognize you.
All right, Elizabeth, you can go.
Hi, Rashika, great job. I was just wondering, in your research so far, what are the main barriers to restoration that you've come across?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there are a few barriers that I kind of learned about when we did our interviews. So one, of course, is that restoration is quite an expensive thing to do, and money is always an issue. However, another really interesting barrier is that for things like easements or land purchases, people, like private landowners, tend to be quite skeptical about this because they really don't want the government being involved out of fear of them, owning their land or something like that. So that's been a really interesting barrier, and there's a lot of work being done to kind of incentivize that a little bit more. One last barrier I would say would also be like competing incentives or competing policies that maybe incentivize practices that contribute to land degradation, such as logging, mining, and so forth. So yeah, thank you for that question.
All right, Alina, you can ask your question.
Great presentation, Rashika. It sounds like an amazing project and a great opportunity to make a change. So regarding the expert interviews that you mentioned, I was wondering what government agencies, representatives that you got a chance to speak with. And the second part of my question is, What was the biggest challenge in conducting these interviews?
So we've kind of looked at a few people who work in like Department of Interior, for example. A few challenges, and sorry, was your question a few challenges in conducting these interviews? Personally, I feel like conducting these interviews have been pretty smooth. We've been quite organized in the process, and it's been a fun process because we really started out with such a broad focus that these interviews have actually helped us really narrow down what's actually happening with information that's not actually available online or like difficult to find online. So I'd say it's been much more helpful than difficult, to be honest.
Great. Rachel, you have the last question.
Hi, Rashika. I thought the example of the Maryland treatable credit scheme was really interesting. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Is it required for certain polluting businesses, or is it voluntary? And is it a statewide program or limited to the Chesapeake Bay region?
That is a fantastic question. I believe it is a state-run program, but focusing on the Chesapeake Bay area. I will have to get back to you and a little bit more information on that. Also, if anyone wants to comment in the chat to expand on that, we are kind of still in the process of researching it a little bit more in depth, but yeah, no, I think it's such a fascinating idea.
Okay, thank you. And again, thank the group for a terrific job. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll go right into our final midterm briefing, which is the project advised by Professor Jossam. And this is on the power of nature, accelerating carbon pricing policies and a legal framework for Ecuador. So Gwen, if you're ready, let's begin.
Right, everyone can see the slides? Great. Hi, I am Gwen Michoni. Today we'll be discussing Ecuador and the question of carbon markets. I'd like to thank our faculty advisor, Professor Jossam, as well as the rest of my team, Karen, Jessica, Russ, Ariella, Caitlin, Griffin, Sophie, and Liz. Now for today, we'll start with a brief introduction of who our client is before we move on to Ecuador and how they are mitigating deforestation. And then we'll talk about nature-based solutions, some carbon pricing mechanisms, and our pathways forward. Now, with Conservation International, there you go. We're looking at ways to use carbon to fund conservation efforts in Ecuador. And Conservation International is a nonprofit environmental organization that's working towards empowering societies to responsibly and sustainably care for nature, our global biodiversity, and the well-being of humanity. Now, Ecuador is actually the first country to give rights to nature when they rewrote the Constitution in 2008. Now, this is very forward-looking, but does present unique problems for implementing nature-based solutions. They've also ratified the Paris Agreement and have set nationally determined contributions to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Ecuador does have a very long history of environmental protection. They've been working with WWF to protect the Galapagos Islands for over 50 years now. They have a population of 17 million. 6.8 of these identify themselves as indigenous, though major indigenous right nonprofits identify as a higher number, up to 30% of the population. Now, this is all within an area slightly smaller than Nevada, which is covered 40% by forests. And this 40% forest is 2% of the entire Amazon basin, which is the largest carbon-based largest land-based carbon sink in the world. Now, there's a problem with deforestation there. Prior to 2008, Ecuador actually had the highest rate of deforestation in South America. Much of this began with its oil boom in the 1970s, as the oil was underground and the forest was on top of it, unfortunately. However, more recently, it's been fueled by agricultural expansion. Now, these drivers are both closely linked to Ecuador's economy, which is largely based on the export of oil and agricultural products. But having ratified the Paris Agreement in 2017 and updating its nationally determined contributions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, Ecuador has ambitions to decarbonize its power sector and to protect more of its Amazonian forests. As one of the planet's most effective carbon sinks, the protection and reforestation of the Amazon has the potential to not only help Ecuador meet its own nationally determined contribution, but to mitigate the impacts of climate change globally. And we could really leverage a powerful nature-based solution here. So what actually is a nature-based solution? So I'll get this right. There you go. Now, CI states that a nature-based solution is any action that conserves, restores, or improves the use or management of these ecosystems while, and this is very important, increasing the carbon storage and or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. And Ecuador currently uses the Socio-Bosque program, which was initiated by Conservation International in 2008. This raises funds to pay landowners to protect the forest with the goal of conserving natural forests and other native ecosystems to protect the ecological, economic, cultural, and spiritual values. It significantly reduce deforestation and associated greenhouse gas emissions, and to improve the well-being of farmers, indigenous communities, and other groups living in the country's rural areas. While progress on deforestation has been made in Socio-Bosque's implementation in 2008, the Ministry of the Environment has suffered budget cuts over the last couple of years, which does make it very difficult to continue funding conservation efforts. So we've been tasked by our client, Conservation International, to weigh the gains and losses of a number of potential carbon pricing options that could help increase funding for the Socio-Bosque program. Great. Now, carbon pricing refers to a number of ways of attaching a price to emissions. In theory, if the cost of emissions is high enough, polluters will choose to reduce emissions to avoid those costs. There are lots of mechanisms to try to achieve this. These include carbon taxes, where polluters pay a tax on the amount of carbon they emit, cap and trade, regulators set a maximum number of emission allowances, and polluters can buy and sell extra allowances between them, a bit like the stock market. And then carbon offsets, where organizations can pay projects that abate carbon emissions and claim the reductions against their own emissions, so offsetting the greenhouse gas emissions. All of these methods have pros and cons, and how effective they are depends on the specific design as well as the situation they are applied to. If successful, they will achieve some reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as generating some revenue either for the government or emissions reduction projects. Now here we have three scenarios. The Colombia system, which is actually a liquid fuel carbon tax and forest offsets. The California system, which is a cap and trade ETS international market system. And Emergent, which is a nonprofit doing voluntary offset, setting up a voluntary offset market. All right, now this is our research methodology thus far. We initially developed a project control plan, started a literature review, which was divided into stakeholders and case studies, and then from there further divided into available carbon pricing mechanisms and gains and losses of those carbon pricing mechanisms for Ecuador. We've also been conducting interviews of subject matter experts, such as academics, nonprofit members, and Ecuadorian government officials. So what comes next for our team? Now that we have decided on 3 pathways to focus on, we need to complete our analysis. This includes some financial analysis to estimate the revenue that each of these mechanisms might produce. We also need to complete some political analysis to determine what the effects of each mechanism might be. And for this, we will be considering the pros and cons of each policy, such as gains and losses of Ecuador not entering the carbon market, and also its impacts on various stakeholder groups, as well as how politically feasible it is. So because of giving rights to nature in the Constitution, Ecuador doesn't allow people to appropriate natural services. So not all potential carbon markets are equally constitutional there. Lastly, we will explore whether there are likely any unintended consequences of each of these mechanisms. Once we've completed our analysis, we'll have to decide what the key points and issues that we should communicate to Conservation International are through our deliverables. This will involve figuring out what the key messages are that Conservation International want to then communicate on to the Minister of the Environment. It is our hope that this work will play a role in convincing the government of Ecuador to resolve the constitutional issues around carbon pricing and pursue policy that benefits Ecuador's forests, people, and their climate. It's not letting me move on. Thank you. Any questions?
Okay, thank you. Okay. Jenny, it looks like you're up first up with questions.
Great job, Gwen. Really well done presentation and very interesting topic. I wanted to know, or I wanted to ask if you could elaborate more on, I guess, the specific stakeholder category of indigenous communities and Ecuador and the impact that carbon pricing would have on indigenous communities, and especially the context of land rights, and I guess how you're looking into that through the social impact assessment you're doing.
Right now, we're mostly looking at that through interactions with nonprofits and officials. But yeah, there is a big issue because sometimes with some carbon offset programs, the government will basically buy and take ownership of the land that was formerly held in indigenous control. And these groups are reluctant to sell to outside groups, understandably. So right now it's an issue of, protecting the land without seizing it from people who have lived there for thousands of years.
All right, Colleen.
Hey, Gwen, thank you so much for that presentation. Let me get a little bit closer to my computer. Someone told me the audio is bad, so hopefully you can hear me okay. So I was curious. Okay, great. I was curious to know, is Ecuador, are they partnering with any international organizations, or are they receiving funding from any international organizations to help them with conservation efforts?
Yeah, right now they're receiving money from the UN's Green Climate Fund, and this is being used to help fund the Socio-Bosque program.
Thanks, Gwen.
Oh, Jenny, you can ask another question.
Thank you. I had a follow-up question. Are you looking at, or maybe if you shared, can you elaborate more on alternatives to carbon pricing, or like, I guess a hybrid where there's like indigenous ownership and stewardship of land management? I think that there are cases of that in other countries.
Well, I'm sure they are. We haven't dug too deeply into that because our issue is mostly the Ecuadorian constitution, where most of the climate solutions we looked at are actually unconstitutional there because they're considered to be appropriating natural services. So you can put money towards conservation in Ecuador, but you're not allowed to basically get something back for it.
All right, that was our last question.
Okay, well, first, I want to congratulate all of the groups and the presenters. Terrific job. It's really impressive to see the diversity of issues that and of clients that the groups are tackling, and the importance of these environmental sustainability problems. And I think what's also, I'm sure, something that each group is figuring is that one of the problems in doing this kind of analysis is figuring out how much work can we actually feasibly do within the time frame and the resources we have, and still move the ball forward and make a contribution. Each group, you can see, is making those choices to say, here's how much we can do, and here's how we can move this forward. And to understand that policy analysis is an iterative process where you try to define the problem, cut it down to size, and then try to figure out, what can we do to help our client along the way, recognizing that once this is done, there'll be another project and then another project as we continue to move forward. So I want to congratulate the groups, the faculty advisors. I think these are all wonderful and really interesting projects. Clients sound terrific, and I'm really looking forward to the final briefings, as I'm sure you are too, and for everybody to be to have these projects in the hands of their clients. So again, congratulations to all, and have a great spring break, and see you at the final briefings. Great job, everybody. Class dismissed.